The mist came off Laurel Fork Creek in thick, breathy sheets that August morning in 2013, drifting through the hollows of Pisgah National Forest like smoke that didn't know where to go. It clung to the trunks of hemlocks and white pines and hung on the leaves of rhododendron so heavily the branches seemed to sag under the weight of it. Summer in these mountains was always a little deceptive. Warm in the towns, cool under the canopy, and quick to remind you that weather had its own rules at higher elevations. The air smelled the way the Blue Ridge always smelled after a damp night. Sap, wet soil, crushed fern, and that sharp, clean tang of running water. Chipmunks skittered through the underbrush. A crow called once one hard note, and then nothing for a long time. It was the kind of morning hikers wrote about, the kind that made you feel like you'd arrived early enough to see the world before it got crowded. Nora Hart, 19 years old, stepped out of her tent at Laurel Fork Campground just after sunrise. She wore a faded charcoal hoodie that had seen too many wash cycles and too many campfires, black leggings, and trail runners with neon green laces. Her dark hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, already frizzing slightly from the damp. In one hand, she held a water bottle. In the other, her phone, though. There was no signal this deep in the forest, and she knew it. A couple in the site across the loop would later tell deputies they remembered her stretching by the picnic table, yawning and staring toward the trailhead that led east into the drainage. She didn't talk to anyone. She didn't wave. She simply started walking like she'd made a decision and didn't want to give her mind time to reconsider it. By noon, Nora Hart had vanished. Her tent was still zipped shut, neat and undisturbed. Her backpack sat untouched inside map, emergency whistle, headlamp, and a small first aid kit exactly where she'd packed them. Her wallet and keys were tucked into the front pocket. Her car, a silver Honda Civic with a dented rear bumper and a Warren Wilson College sticker on the back window, remained parked at the campground entrance. The ranger station log showed she'd checked in alone the previous afternoon and listed her stay as 2 nights. She'd paid in cash. When her mother, Mary Ann Hart, called the ranger station on Sunday, August 18th, asking if anyone had seen her daughter, the panic began immediately. Nora had promised she'd call home by Saturday evening. She always did what she said she would do. Mary Ann knew something was wrong the moment the phone didn't ring. She waited through the evening, telling herself that reception in the mountains was unreliable, that Nora might have taken a longer hike than planned, that she might be sitting by a stream with a notebook and no concept of time. But when morning came, and there was still nothing, no call, no text, no social media. Post Mary Ann's worry sharpened into something heavier, something that felt like instinct more than fear. Search and rescue teams were dispatched within hours. Volunteers from nearby towns, Brevard, Rosman, Hendersonville, arrived by Sunday morning. Tracking dogs picked up Nora's scent near the trailhead and followed it for roughly a mile before losing it near a rocky creek, crossing where water ran fast and shallow over slate. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades chopping the air above the canopy. Searchers combed the slopes, checked overhangs, scanned ridgelines, called her name until their throats burned. They found nothing. No dropped bottle, no torn fabric, no shoe prints leading into brush, no sign of a struggle. The weather had been clear all week. No storms, no flash floods, no reason for someone to simply disappear. And yet Nora Hart was gone. Her friends described her as careful, almost obsessively so, the kind of person who planned trips down to the smallest detail. She was a sophomore at Warren Wilson, studying environmental science, already talking about restoration ecology and watershed work as if it was a calling rather than a major. She loved the outdoors, but she wasn't reckless. She'd hiked alone before and always told someone where she was going. She carried a paper map even when everyone else relied on GPS. Her social media was full of photos of wildflowers, sunrise ridgelines, field notes scribbled in the margins of sketchbook pages. The last post, dated August 16th, read, "2 days alone in the forest. No phone, no noise, just me and the trail. I need this." It didn't sound like someone running away from life. It sounded like someone stepping toward it. The investigation moved quickly at first. Detectives from the Transylvania County Sheriff's Office interviewed every camper they could locate from that weekend. A couple from Charlotte remembered seeing Nora the night before she vanished, sitting alone by a fire ring, writing in a notebook. A solo hiker said he'd passed her on the trail Saturday morning, exchanged a brief hello, and noticed she seemed distracted, staring toward the ridgeline as if she'd heard something. Another camper, an older man traveling with a dog, mentioned hearing footsteps near his tent around dawn on Sunday, but he hadn't looked outside. He'd assumed it was another early riser heading out before the heat. None of it added up to anything solid, only fragments, impressions, half-formed memories. By the third day of searching, frustration set in. Pisgah was massive, a labyrinth of steep terrain and thick undergrowth and creek beds that cut unexpected paths through the mountains. Nora could have wandered off trail. She could have fallen into a hidden ravine. She could have gotten turned around in mist so thick it felt like walking inside a cloud. But the dogs should have found something. A scrap of cloth, a dropped phone, a footprint that didn't belong. Instead, there was only silence. On August 22nd, a week after her disappearance, the official search was scaled back. Volunteer efforts continued sporadically for another 10 days, but the optimism that had fueled the first push began to drain away. Mary Ann Hart refused to leave the area. She rented a small cabin outside Roseman and spent every day walking trails herself, calling her daughter's name until her voice turned raw and thin. She kept her phone on loud at all times, as if Nora might call from nowhere and everything would snap back into place. In early September, a hiker discovered a gray hoodie snagged on a branch near a tributary locals called Bear Hollow Branch, roughly 3 miles northeast of Laurel Fork Campground. It was faded and damp, speckled with moss, caught on the limb as if the forest had reached out and held it there. Mary Ann identified it immediately. Nora had worn that hoodie since high school. It was the one she grabbed when she was tired, when she was anxious, when she wanted comfort without admitting she needed it. She'd refused to throw it away even when it started to fray at the cuffs. The discovery reignited the search. Teams returned to Bear Hollow Branch and combed every inch of forest around the creek. They found nothing else. No phone, no shoes, no body. Only the hoodie hanging like an accusation in the trees. Theories multiplied the way they always did when facts were scarce. Some believed Nora had gotten lost, overheated, stripped off her hoodie, and continued deeper into the wilderness. Others suspected an animal encounter, though there were no reports that summer of aggressive bears or a cougar attack in that section of forest. And then there were the whispers, the darker possibilities that nobody wanted to say aloud, but everyone thought about. The campground was remote, but it wasn't isolated. People passed through. Day hikers, hunters, men sleeping in their trucks, drifters who moved from forest to forest because it was easier than facing the world in a town. What if someone had been watching her? What if she hadn't walked into the woods alone? Detectives pursued every lead. They reviewed her phone records. They searched her dorm room. They interviewed classmates, professors, the lab coordinator who'd supervised her field work. Nora had no enemies, no volatile breakup, no history of depression or threats of self-harm. She was, by every account, a young woman excited about what came next. She'd recently been accepted into a summer research program studying stream restoration in the French Broad watershed. Her professors called her driven and brilliant. Her friends said she was the glue, the one who remembered birthdays and left handwritten notes in people's mailboxes. She wasn't the kind of person who vanished without a trace. By October, the case cooled. Nora Hart was officially listed as missing and endangered. Her photo appeared on flyers posted in gas stations and grocery stores and at trailheads across western North Carolina. Mary Ann created a Facebook page. Bring Nora home, and strangers began to follow it by the thousands. Vigils were held in Asheville and on the college campus. Students tied yellow ribbons to trees along the main walkway. But weeks turned into months. Updates slowed. The forest kept its secrets. Winter came early that year, blanketing higher elevations with snow by mid-November. The search didn't stop, but it became almost impossible to sustain. Volunteers couldn't navigate frozen trails safely. Helicopters were grounded during storms. The mountains turned into a white fortress. Silent. Sealed. Mary Ann stayed in the cabin near Rosman anyway. She kept a single candle burning in the window every night. Local residents began leaving food on her porch. Firewood appeared stacked by her door. No one knew what to say to a mother whose daughter had been erased. Nora's father, Thomas Hart, a retired high school teacher from Winston-Salem, drove out every weekend to join the search. He was quiet and methodical, the kind of man who believed problems could be solved through persistence and logic. He printed maps and marked every trail, every creek crossing, every plausible route his daughter might have taken. He studied weather patterns from August. He read incident reports from other wilderness missing person cases. He built spreadsheets tracking sightings, witness statements, and grid coordinates. But the data led nowhere. In December, a winter storm knocked out power across parts of the county for 3 days. When roads cleared, Thomas drove to Laurel Fork Campground alone. The place was deserted, buried under snow. He walked the trail Nora had taken that August morning, following the path the dogs had tracked before losing her scent. The creek was frozen now, silent beneath a sheet of ice. He stood at the crossing for a long time, staring at the place where his daughter's presence had ended, as if the forest might eventually get tired of holding its breath and finally tell him what it knew. A ranger found him after dark, sitting in his truck with the engine running, hands locked around the steering wheel. The ranger drove him back to Rosman and called Mary Ann. That night, Thomas broke in a way Mary Ann had never seen. He sobbed into her shoulder and said the words neither of them had been able to speak aloud. "She's not coming back." Mary Ann wouldn't accept it. She contacted private investigators, psychics, specialists with cadaver dogs. She posted on true crime forums, reaching out to anyone who claimed they could see patterns where law enforcement saw only dead ends. One user, someone who went by Topo Sleuth, claimed to have solved multiple cold cases using satellite imagery and topographic mapping. Mary Ann sent them everything: photos, coordinates, trail descriptions, timelines. Weeks passed. Topo Sleuth eventually stopped responding. Another door closed. In March of 2014, 6 months after Nora disappeared, her friends organized a memorial hike. 30 students drove into Pisgah, carrying photos, wildflowers, and a grief too big for their bodies. They hiked Laurel Fork Trail together, reading poems Nora had written in her journals, singing songs she'd loved. Near Bear Hollow Branch, they built a small cairn from river stones. On top, they placed a laminated photo of Nora smiling in front of a waterfall. It was meant as love, but it felt like surrender. The case file remained open on one desk in the sheriff's office, the desk of Detective Allison Brewer. Brewer was in her early 40s, a former park ranger who joined law enforcement after seeing too many missing person cases fade into paperwork. She knew the forest well. She understood how easy it was for someone inexperienced to vanish. But Nora wasn't inexperienced. That was what gnawed at Brewer most. She revisited witness statements. The couple who'd seen Nora writing by the fire remembered the notebook clearly. That notebook hadn't been found in the tent, in the car, in the dorm room. Brewer pulled security footage from a gas station in Brevard, where Nora had stopped on her way to the campground. The video was grainy, but it showed enough. Nora filling her tank, going inside to pay, buying a granola bar and a bottle of water. She was alone. She looked calm. She looked like a person with plans. Brewer dug deeper anyway. No suspicious online activity. No financial trouble. No secret relationship. Her phone records were normal. Her bank transactions were mundane. Textbooks, coffee, gas, grocery store runs. Spring came and the investigation stalled. Resources were limited. Other cases demanded attention. Eventually, Nora Hart became what missing people so often became. A name in a file cabinet, a face on an aging poster, a story that locals remembered, but the rest of the world began to forget. Marianne stopped posting daily updates. Thomas returned home and tried to live around the hole in his life. The candle in the cabin window went dark, but the forest remembered. Hikers began to report strange unease near Bear Hollow Branch. Some claimed they heard footsteps behind them and turned to see nothing. Others said they spotted a figure in gray moving between the trees at dawn, just out of focus, always gone when they tried to get closer. Some dismissed it as grief turning into folklore, a community trying to give shape to something unbearable. Others weren't so sure. In June of 2014, 10 months after Nora vanished, a group of geology students from Appalachian State University conducted a survey near the South Fork of Laurel Fork Creek, mapping fault lines and mineral seams in a remote section of forest rarely used by casual hikers. One student scrambling down a steep embankment to collect samples saw something wedged between two boulders. It was a phone case, purple, with a cracked screen protector. She pulled it free and turned it over. Someone had scratched initials into the plastic. Torch. The students called the sheriff's office immediately. Detective Brewer arrived within 2 hours. She held the phone case in gloved hands, turning it over carefully. There was no doubt. It belonged to Nora. But the phone itself was missing. Only the case remained, abandoned like a breadcrumb in a place Nora had no reason to go. Brewer ordered a new search of the area. They found nothing else, and the questions that had never stopped whispering in the background rose again, louder now. How had the case ended up nearly 4 miles from the campground, in terrain that wasn't on any casual day hike itinerary? Had Nora gone there on her own? Had she been chased? Had someone carried it? The case was reopened officially. New volunteers were recruited. Brewer brought in specialists, search coordinators, a forensic botanist who understood plant growth and decomposition in temperate forests, analysts who could look at the geography as if it was a puzzle rather than a landscape. They returned to Bear Hollow Branch. They returned to the geology site. They analyzed soil. They used ground-penetrating radar where the terrain allowed. Weeks passed. The mountains gave them nothing. By August of 2014, 1 year after Nora walked into the mist, the searches stopped again, and Pisgah, dense and ancient and indifferent, held its secret a while longer. Years passed, the way creek water passes over stone, steady, patient, eroding edges. By 2016, Nora Hart's name had become a campfire story among hikers, told in lowered voices, always with the same ending: the girl who walked into the fog and never came out. Rangers dismissed it as myth, but even they didn't love patrolling that section of forest after dark. Marianne moved back to Winston-Salem, though she never really left Pisgah. She kept Nora's bedroom as it had been, textbooks stacked on the desk, hiking boots by the door, a half-finished painting of Looking Glass Rock propped against the wall. Twice a year she returned to the forest, in August, on the anniversary, and in May, on Nora's birthday. She'd drive to Laurel Fork Campground, hike alone, and leave fresh flowers at the cairn near Bear Hollow Branch. The laminated photo had faded over time. Nora's smile barely visible now, so Marianne replaced it every visit. Thomas withdrew into himself. He retired early. He stopped answering calls from friends. Most days, he sat in his garage surrounded by maps and old copies of case updates, convincing himself there had to be a pattern he simply hadn't recognized yet. Detective Allison Brewer was promoted to sergeant, but she kept Nora's case file in her office. Every few months she pulled it out and reread witness statements, scanning for something she might have missed. The phone case bothered her most. 4 miles in the wrong direction, in a place that felt more like a hiding spot than a destination. In the autumn of 2017, a new lead surfaced from an unexpected place. A man named Caleb Arnett, serving time in a North Carolina state prison for armed robbery, contacted authorities claiming he had information about Nora Hart. In the summer of 2013, Arnett said he'd been living off-grid around Pisgah camping illegally, moving often, avoiding police, surviving on theft and whatever he could trade. He told investigators he'd seen a young woman matching Nora's description near Laurel Fork that August, but she hadn't been alone. There had been a man with her, he said. Tall, middle-aged, wearing a khaki jacket and a baseball cap. Arnett couldn't see his face clearly, but he remembered the way the man stood close to the woman. Too close, like he was claiming space that wasn't his. Arnett admitted he'd been high at the time, paranoid, hiding in brush because he thought someone was looking for him. He hadn't thought much of it until he saw Nora's face years later in a prison library article about missing hikers. The memory had stuck like a burr. Brewer drove to the prison the next day. She sat across from Arnett in a gray interview room and studied him for signs of performance. He was gaunt, restless, eyes flicking too often toward corners. But his story carried detail that didn't feel borrowed from the news. He described the location, a bend in the trail near a fallen cedar, about half a mile from the campground. He remembered the woman's gray hoodie and dark ponytail. He remembered the man carrying a green backpack and looking over his shoulder as if he didn't want anyone to notice them. Brewer brought in a sketch artist. Arnett tried for hours to build a face out of memory. The result was maddeningly generic. White male, average build, 40 to 55. Nothing distinctive. Could have been 100 men. Brewer ran the description against databases, cross-referenced it with known offenders in the region, looked for similar reports in 2013. Nothing fit. She returned to Laurel Fork and walked the trail Arnett described. The fallen cedar was still there, softening into the earth under thick moss. Brewer stood at the bend and tried to picture what Arnett claimed he'd seen. A young woman and an older man walking together. The man's presence wrong in a way you could feel, even at a distance. Was it real? Or was it a story built by time, drugs, and guilt? Without identification, without corroboration, Arnett's lead was just another shadow in a file folder. By 2018, Nora had been missing 5 years. Marianne's Facebook page still lived, but posts had slowed to anniversaries and birthdays. The comments were full of strangers offering prayers, theories, and certainty they hadn't earned. Brewer read them sometimes late at night. Most were noise talk of cults, trafficking rings, conspiracies under the trees. But occasionally, a small detail made her pause. A hiker describing a man asking women if they were alone. A camper recalling a white truck lingering too long on a Forest Service road. A ranger remembering someone asking questions about the missing college girl, and then vanishing before anyone got his name. Time did what it always did. It blurred. In early 2019, the sheriff's office gained a new detective, Jordan Pike, fresh from specialized training in forensic mapping, missing person analytics, and cold case reconstruction. Pike asked Brewer if he could review Nora's file. Brewer handed it over immediately, grateful someone else cared enough to look. Pike digitized everything. He built a timeline. He plotted sightings and evidence points on maps. He studied the geology site where the phone case had been found and noticed something Brewer hadn't emphasized. The location sat near unstable slopes, prone to small landslides and soil displacement. What if it wasn't carried there by a person? Pike asked. What if the mountains moved it? It sounded like reaching, but Pike backed it with research. He consulted geologists, studied erosion patterns, reviewed rainfall data from 2013 to 2014. He developed a theory. A severe winter storm could have dislodged the phone case from wherever it originally fell and carried it downstream through channels that didn't look like channels on a map. Seasonal waterways, underground seep, debris flows. If Pike was right, it meant Nora might still be near the original search zone, buried under sediment and forest debris in a place nobody could see. Brewer didn't fully believe it, but cold cases didn't reward pride. In June 2019, they organized a new search focused on areas of significant erosion and past slope failure. They brought in ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs trained to detect remains buried deep, and a small forensic archaeology team that knew how to excavate without destroying what time hadn't already ruined. The search lasted 2 weeks. They covered miles of terrain. They scanned creek beds. They tested suspicious depressions. They found animal bones, rusted cans, old camping gear, remnants of illegal fire pits. No Nora. On the final day, one of the cadaver dogs alerted near a collapsed embankment along the south fork of Laurel Fork Creek. The handler froze. The dog circled, sniffed again, and alerted a second time with certainty. The team began to dig. They removed layers of rock and soil carefully, measuring depth, recording placement, treating the earth like a crime scene rather than a wilderness. 6 feet down, they found fabric gray, faded, decomposed, and beneath it, fragments of bone. Small pieces, weathered. The kind of remains you didn't want to believe could belong to a human being, and yet you knew, with a sick certainty, that they probably did. Everything was collected and transported to the state crime lab for analysis. Brewer called Nora Hart that evening. She chose her words carefully, because words could be cruel, even when they were honest. "We may have found something," Brewer said. "We don't know yet. Please, please, try not to let your mind run ahead of the facts." But Marianne had lived on a thin wire of hope for 6 years. Facts had been scarce. Hope was what she had left. The remains arrived at the state lab on a Tuesday morning in late June. A forensic anthropologist, Dr. Lucia Moreno, began the meticulous work of turning fragments into truth. The bones were degraded by moisture and temperature changes and microbial activity. But modern techniques had advanced. The lab extracted a partial DNA profile using methods designed for compromised samples. Marianne had provided a DNA reference years earlier. The comparison took 3 days. On July 2, 2019, Dr. Moreno called Detective Brewer. It was a match. The remains belonged to Nora Hart. Brewer closed her office door, sat down, and let herself be silent for a moment. Not because silence was appropriate, but because it was the only thing that fit. After 6 years, they had found her. Not alive. Not the miracle Marianne had begged the universe for. But found. Brewer drove to Winston-Salem herself. She wouldn't deliver news like that through a phone line. Marianne opened the door, already crying, as if some part of her had recognized the shape of Brewer's car turning into the driveway and understood what it meant. They sat together in a living room full of photos. Nora laughing, Nora on trails, Nora in a graduation cap, Nora holding a painted canvas like it was a shield against the world. Brewer said the words every detective dreads. "We found her. I'm so sorry. Thomas arrived later and didn't speak for a long time. He sat on the porch steps beside Mary Ann as the sun went down, the two of them suspended between relief and devastation. Relief that the searching was no longer endless. Devastation that the end looked like this. The next morning, Brewer returned to Pisgah with a full forensic team. Now that they knew where Nora had been found, the excavation expanded. Over the course of a week, they recovered additional bone fragments, remnants of clothing, pieces of a shoe. And then, 18 inches deeper than the remains, tucked beneath a slab of rock and sealed against moisture, they found something that changed the shape of the case entirely. A small waterproof pouch hikers used for valuables. Inside was a notebook. The notebook witnesses had seen Nora writing in the night before she disappeared. The pages were damp but intact, protected by the seal. Brewer and Pike opened it carefully, turning each page with gloved hands, as if the paper might crumble under a tension. The entries began earlier that summer. Field notes, sketches of plants, observations about water quality and insects, reflections on solitude, and the way quiet could feel like medicine. But the final entries written at Laurel Fork were different. The first was dated August 16, 2013, arrived around 3:00, set up camp. It feels perfect here, quiet, safe. Saw a man watching from across the loop earlier. He left before I could decide whether to say hello. Probably nothing. The entry for August 17th grew more uneasy. Saw him again. He was standing off the path, just standing. Smiled when I passed, but didn't speak. Later, he was sitting at the picnic table near my site, like it belonged to him. Said his name was Dale. Said he camps here every year. Asked if I was alone. I told him I'm meeting friends tomorrow. I don't know why I lied. I didn't like the way he looked at me. Then came the final entry, dated August 18th longer. Hurried, the handwriting tightening as if her hand didn't want to slow down. He's still here, Dale. I saw him near the trailhead this morning. I decided to hike anyway. Told myself I was being dramatic. He followed me. Not close, but always there when I looked back. Like he was pacing me. I turned off the main trail to lose him. For a minute I thought it worked. Then he was ahead of me, just standing there like he'd been waiting. I asked what he wanted. He said the forest was dangerous for a girl alone. Said he could keep me safe. I told him to leave me alone. I tried to pass, and he grabbed my arm. Not hard. Firm. Like I was a thing. I pulled away and ran. I'm off trail. I can hear the creek but can't see it. I'm going to wait until it gets dark and try to get back. If anyone finds this, his name is Dale. Khaki jacket, blue baseball cap, drives a white older pickup. I saw it near the ranger station. Please find me. That was the last entry. Brewer read it once, then again. Then she closed the notebook and looked at Pike with a kind of grim clarity that felt almost like anger. This was no longer a case of someone wandering off and getting lost. This was a predator. This was a crime. The investigation shifted immediately. Brewer and Pike pulled campground records for August 2013, searching for anyone who might match the name Dale. The logs were imperfect cash payments, incomplete sign-ins, missing information that now felt unforgivable. They broadened the search. White pickups registered to men named Dale across North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia. Thousands of names came back. They cross-referenced criminal histories, focusing on violence, stalking, harassment. The list narrowed. One name stood out. Dale Eugene Kessler, 52. Last known address outside Brevard, less than 30 miles from Laurel Fork Campground. Kessler had a history. In the late 1990s, he'd been charged after an altercation with a female hiker near a popular overlook off the Blue Ridge Parkway. Charges were dropped when the victim moved away and refused to testify. In the mid-2000s, he'd been investigated for harassment after multiple women reported being followed on trails. No charges. In 2011, a restraining order had been issued after a woman claimed he showed up at her home, uninvited, following a chance meeting on a hike. The order expired after 2 years. Rangers knew his name the way they knew the names of men who lived too long in the woods and forgot how to behave around people. He spent weeks camping alone. He worked odd jobs. He drifted. His vehicle, a white older model pickup. Brewer compared Kessler's photo to the vague sketch from Caleb Arnett's memory. It wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to make Brewer's stomach tighten. They requested a check on Kessler's last known location. Officers found him 3 days later, camping illegally near a Forest Service spur road, less than 15 miles from where Nora's remains had been recovered. When approached, he was calm, almost friendly. He didn't resist. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He only smiled and said softly, "I wondered when you'd show up." They booked Dale Eugene Kessler into the Transylvania County Jail on July 12, 2019, just after dusk. The processing deputy noted that he was unusually composed, no shaking hands, no anger, no pleading. He answered routine questions in a flat voice, as if he'd done it before or had rehearsed doing it. He listed his occupation as handyman, gave an address that didn't check out, and when asked for an emergency contact, he paused long enough that the deputy repeated the question. Kessler finally said, "I don't have one." Sergeant Allison Brewer conducted the first recorded interview the following morning. The room was small and overly bright, the kind of place designed to make people uncomfortable. Kessler sat with his hands folded on the table, posture straight. He was tall and lean, weathered by sun and wind. His face had that leathery texture common in people who spend years outside. His eyes were pale and unsettlingly steady. Brewer placed a photograph of Nora Hart on the table between them. "Do you recognize her?" she asked. Kessler looked at the photo for a long time, not with the stunned confusion of an innocent man seeing a stranger, but with the calm attention of someone studying an object he already knew. Then he nodded. "I remember her," he said. Brewer asked where. Kessler said he'd seen her at Laurel Fork in August of 2013. He said they'd spoken a few times. He said she'd been friendly at first, and then got weird. He said he'd offered advice warnings about bears, warnings about slippery rocks, warnings about how a woman shouldn't hike alone without telling someone. Brewer listened without interrupting. Then she asked, "Did you follow her?" Kessler's mouth tightened slightly, as if the question offended him. "I walked the same trails," he said. "If she thought that was following, that's her problem." Brewer kept her tone even. "Did you touch her?" Kessler's eyes flicked down and back up. "No." "Did you threaten her?" "No." Brewer opened the evidence folder and laid out a photograph of the waterproof pouch, and then a close-up image of the notebook's final entry. Nora's handwriting, the words sharp and panicked on the page. When Brewer said, "We found this with her," something moved across Kessler's expression. Not grief, not surprise. A brief tightening at the corners of his eyes, recognition perhaps, and the first hint that he understood how narrow the room was becoming. Brewer read aloud the description. Khaki jacket, blue baseball cap, white older pickup. Then she said the name Nora had written. Dale. Kessler's hands didn't move, but Brewer noticed the smallest change. His fingers pressed into each other harder, knuckles whitening. Brewer asked him directly, "What happened to Nora Hart?" Kessler leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, as if the answer was written there, as if he only needed to read it. For nearly a minute, he said nothing. Then, quietly, he spoke as though he was explaining a law of nature rather than a crime. "She shouldn't have run." Brewer didn't move. "Is that your explanation?" Kessler's gaze returned to the table. "People run in the woods," he said. "They get hurt." Brewer held her ground. "Did you hurt her?" Kessler's lips parted, and for a moment he looked like he might say something bold or cruel, the kind of thing predators sometimes say when they believe they're smarter than everyone else. But he didn't. He only blinked once and said, "I tried to keep her safe. It wasn't a legal confession. Not cleanly. Not yet." But it was enough for Brewer to end the interview, step out, and call the district attorney's office with a voice that had turned cold and focused. Within 24 hours, prosecutors had filed initial charges: second-degree murder, kidnapping, and false imprisonment. Bail was denied. The first court date was set. And for the first time in 6 years, the Hart family felt something they had almost stopped allowing themselves to imagine. Not relief, not peace, but movement. News of Kessler's arrest spread fast through the hiking community, faster than any official press release, carried the way stories always travel in the outdoors, through group chats, forums, gear shops, trailhead conversations. Within hours, women began posting accounts that sounded eerily familiar. A woman from Asheville wrote about being followed near Looking Glass Rock by a man in a khaki jacket who stayed just far enough back that she couldn't confront him without feeling silly. Another hiker described a stranger appearing at her dispersed campsite, offering unsolicited advice about predators, asking questions that didn't feel casual. "Are you alone? Does anyone know you're here? How long are you staying?" A jogger recalled a white pickup creeping along a Forest Service road while she ran, the driver never passing, never falling far behind. Most of them admitted they hadn't reported it at the time. They had talked themselves out of it. They had told themselves they were being paranoid. They had been trained by culture, by habit, by a lifetime of being told to be polite, to doubt their own discomfort. Now, reading the notebook entry, they understood something with sick clarity. They hadn't been paranoid. They had been lucky. Detective Jordan Pike and Brewer began the slow, exhausting process of connecting those reports to Kessler's movements. He'd worked sporadically across 3 states for decades, rarely staying anywhere long. A week fixing fences on a small farm, a month repairing roofs. Then he'd vanish into the forest, sometimes for months. He lived out of his truck. He slipped through systems designed to track people with steady addresses and predictable routines. But he had a weakness. He loved the woods too much to truly disappear. They tracked his vehicle history. He'd owned the same white pickup since the mid-1990s. He'd let the registration lapse more than once. He'd accumulated parking tickets at trailheads and campgrounds, the kind most people ignore until they add up to something serious. In his case, those tickets became a breadcrumb trail. In late July, forensic teams executed a search warrant on Kessler's truck, which had been impounded after his arrest. The vehicle was a wreck: camping gear piled on camping gear, empty food containers, half-burned candles, tools, ropes, old receipts, and stacks of weathered notebooks. The notebooks weren't diaries in the normal sense. They weren't reflections. They weren't therapy. They were logs. Page after page contained observations about women he'd seen on trails, what they wore, whether they were alone, where they camped, what time they passed a certain junction, whether they smiled at him or ignored him. Some entries included crude sketches, side profiles, ponytails, shoulder straps of backpacks. Other pages contained rants, angry and childish, about women who'd told him to go away. He called them rude, ungrateful. He wrote that they asked for trouble by hiking alone. One entry, dated July 2013, made Brewer feel physically ill. Saw a girl at Laurel Fork, dark hair, college age, alone, too sure of herself. Doesn't understand what the woods can do. Someone should teach her. It was written 3 weeks before Nora disappeared. Analysts processed the truck for physical evidence. They found hair samples, fibers, soil consistent with the slope where Nora had been recovered. On their own, each piece was not a smoking gun. Together, they formed a picture. Then a technician lifted the passenger seat and found something wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, shoved into a narrow space as if Kessler had wanted it near him, but hidden. A silver necklace with a small turquoise pendant. Brewer photographed it and showed the image to Nora Hart, who recognized it instantly. Nora had worn that necklace daily since her 16th birthday. It had been a gift from her grandmother. The necklace was not just evidence, it was a message. Kessler had kept it as a trophy. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Elena Quinn, built the case carefully. They had the notebook with a written description and the name Dale. They had the necklace found in his truck. They had his journals documenting a long obsession with lone women on trails. They had forensic evidence linking his vehicle to the area where Nora had been buried. And they had his own words. She shouldn't have run. Quinn knew it wasn't perfect. The remains were too degraded to determine a clear cause of death. There was no murder weapon. There were no witnesses to the moment Nora died. A defense attorney could try to argue circumstantial evidence, could claim the necklace had been found later in the forest, could frame the notebook entry as fear, not fact. But Quinn believed a jury would see what she saw, a pattern, a predator, a young woman who listened to her instincts too late. In September 2019, Kessler's public defender attempted to negotiate a plea deal. He proposed manslaughter, 15 years, possibility of parole. Quinn rejected it. He offered involuntary manslaughter, suggesting Nora had fallen while running and Kessler had panicked. Quinn rejected that too. She met with Marianne and Thomas Hart and asked what they wanted. Some families wanted closure quickly. Some wanted to avoid trial. Some wanted to protect themselves from the details. Marianne's answer was clear. "I want the truth told in open court," she said. "I want him named. I want him seen for what he is." The trial was scheduled for early 2020. Then, in late November 2019, Detective Pike uncovered something that changed the weight of the case. He'd been reviewing missing person reports across the southern Appalachians, looking for similarities. Lone women, cars left at trailheads, campsites undisturbed, vanishings in forest corridors where Kessler had collected tickets and citations. He found 3 cases that made his skin prickle. In 2004, a 22-year-old woman named Haley Granger vanished while hiking alone near the edge of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Her car was found at the trailhead. Her backpack was recovered 2 miles in. Her body was never found. In 2008, a 19-year-old named Sierra Lane disappeared from a campground near Linville Gorge. She told friends she was going for a short walk before dinner. She never came back. In 2011, a 31-year-old woman named Marisol Vega went missing during a solo backpacking trip in the Shining Rock Wilderness. Search teams found her tent set up, food untouched, and no sign of Marisol. Pike cross-referenced dates and locations with the scraps of data they had on Kessler old job stubs, citations, registration records, a hunting permit application with a county address, a repair receipt from a mechanic shop near a trail corridor. The overlaps were too strong to ignore. Quinn didn't want speculation. She wanted proof. But Pike had enough to justify reopening. They contacted the families, requested DNA reference samples, began planning searches where possible, using new technology and cadaver dogs trained for deep burial detection. In December 2019, a team returned to the area near where Haley Granger's backpack had been recovered 15 years earlier. They searched beyond the original grids, into rougher terrain. A cadaver dog alerted near a shallow depression beneath a fallen tree. The roots tangled like fingers gripping the soil. They dug carefully. The remains were fragmentary, but dental records confirmed identity. Haley Granger. Forensic analysis revealed blunt force trauma to the skull. She hadn't gotten lost. She had been murdered. A search in January 2020 near Linville Gorge uncovered remains consistent with Sierra Lane, buried in a ravine less than a mile from the campground where she'd vanished. The third search for Marisol Vega yielded no immediate results. Shining Rock was vast and brutal, and time had erased too much. But 2 out of 3 was enough to reshape the case entirely. Dale Eugene Kessler was charged with 2 additional counts of first-degree murder. The trial, now covering 3 murders, was postponed to allow both sides time to prepare. And then, in March 2020, the world changed. The COVID-19 pandemic shut down courthouses. Hearings moved online. The legal system slowed to a crawl. For Marianne Hart, the delay was another kind of cruelty. She had waited 6 years for a body, then months for an arrest, then months for clarity, and now the final step. Justice was trapped behind a closed courthouse door. She spent the pandemic months in her house, watching updates online, attending virtual hearings where Kessler appeared by video, face flat, eyes unnervingly calm. Thomas threw himself into helping Pike compile timelines for the additional charges. He corresponded with the families of Haley Granger and Sierra Lane. They formed a small community bound together by the same man, the same mountains, the same grief. When the trial date finally emerged on the calendar late 2021, it felt both impossibly far away and terrifyingly close. Because trial didn't just mean verdict. Trial meant details. It meant reliving Nora's final morning in public, under fluorescent lights, while strangers judged which parts of her fear were reasonable. And Marianne had learned long ago that the world demanded a different kind of proof from women's instincts. The trial finally began in October 2021, more than 2 years after Dale Eugene Kessler's arrest. The courthouse in Brevard was small, and dated wooden benches rubbed smooth by decades of restless knees, fluorescent lights that hummed too loudly, and a faint smell of old paper and floor polish that never quite went away. COVID protocols still limited seating. The room felt tighter than it should have, as if the walls themselves were listening. Marianne and Thomas Hart sat in the front row, wearing masks, hands clasped together so tightly their fingers looked pale. Behind them sat the families of Haley Granger and Sierra Lane strangers, who had become something like kin through shared loss. The proceedings were streamed online, watched by thousands, who typed their opinions into comment boxes from the safety of distance. Deputy District Attorney Elena Quinn stood and opened with a timeline that moved like a blade. She walked the jury through Nora's final days, her check-in at Laurel Fork, the early morning hike, the vanishing, the hoodie in the trees, the phone case near the geology survey site, the years of searching, and then the collapsed embankment that finally gave up a body. Then Quinn introduced the notebook. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't need to. She simply placed it into evidence and called witnesses who could authenticate it. The forensic examiner who verified ink and paper age, the lab analyst who confirmed the pouch had sealed it from the worst moisture, the detective who had recovered it from the soil. When Quinn read Nora's last entry aloud, the courtroom became so quiet that even the building's humming lights felt loud. Khaki jacket, blue baseball cap, white pickup. Please find me. Quinn's voice remained controlled, but there was something steady and furious beneath it, anger held inside rules. Then she turned to the truck search. The state presented photographs of Kessler's impounded vehicle, the chaos of gear and trash and tools, the stacks of handwritten journals like a private library of obsession. A forensic analyst testified that the journals were not casual ramblings. They were patterns, repeated behaviors written down over years. Quinn had the analyst read selected excerpts, short ones, chosen not for shock value, but for clarity. Descriptions of women on trails, notes about whether they were alone, comments about who looked too confident. One entry dated 3 weeks before Nora's disappearance was projected onto a screen. Someone should teach her. A murmur moved through the courtroom and died quickly under the judge's glare. Then Quinn introduced the necklace, the turquoise pendant recovered beneath the passenger seat. Mary Ann had already identified it in private. Seeing it held up by a gloved hand in open court still felt like being punched. That necklace had been part of Nora's everyday life, something she wore without thinking, something that made her feel connected to family and history and comfort. In court, it became what predators always turned belongings into: proof of control. The defense attorney, Graham Lasky, argued reasonable doubt. He admitted Kessler was odd. He admitted he had poor social skills. He admitted the journals were unfortunate, creepy, evidence of loneliness and resentment. But he insisted those things did not prove murder. He suggested Nora's notebook reflected anxiety rather than reality. He argued the necklace could have been found later in the forest and kept disturbing, yes, but not evidence of homicide. He reminded the jury repeatedly that there was no recorded confession, no eyewitness, and no definitive cause of death. "People die in wilderness," Lasky said, pacing. "Accidents happen. Panic happens. Falls happen. Exposure happens." He wanted the forest to carry blame because the forest could not speak back. Quinn responded by placing responsibility where it belonged. She called Detective Brewer to testify about Kessler's interview, the way he spoke about Nora as if her fear was an insult to him, the way he said she shouldn't have run, not with sorrow, but with irritation, like a man whose plans had been inconvenienced. Then Quinn introduced a piece of evidence that made the defense's posture shift. A handwriting analyst had compared entries in Kessler's journals and determined that certain pages had been written after Nora disappeared. Pages that referenced the girl and the mountains keeping secrets. The analyst explained the reasoning: ink composition, paper aging, and the presence of references to events that occurred after 2013. One entry, dated 2014, was read into the record. "They'll never find her. The woods hide things better than people." It wasn't a confession either, not directly. But it was the kind of statement juries understood instinctively, the kind of sentence you didn't write unless you knew what "her" meant. For the additional murders, Haley Granger and Sierra Lane, the prosecution's case was more complex. Quinn relied on a lattice of evidence rather than a single beam. Kessler's documented presence in those regions, similarities in victim profile and circumstances, and the fact that 2 bodies, once missing for years, had been found after he was arrested and after Pike's searches refocused in places Kessler was linked to. A medical examiner testified about blunt force trauma to Haley's skull. A forensic anthropologist testified about soil patterns, suggesting Sierra had been intentionally concealed. The state argued that Kessler's behavior tracking women, targeting solitude, and keeping trophies was consistent with a serial predator, not a lone coincidence. The defense tried to fracture the pattern. He attacked Pike's methods, questioned search decisions, claimed confirmation bias. He suggested that once the state decided Kessler was a monster, everything in the woods began to look like a monster's footprint. But the journals sat there like a gravity well. Every argument orbited them. When Mary Ann took the stand for victim impact testimony, she didn't perform grief. She didn't give the courtroom what some people expected: collapse, dramatics, sobbing so loud it turned heads. She spoke plainly. She described Nora's carefulness, her love of ecosystems, the way she labeled things, the way she left notes for people who were stressed, the way she'd been proud to hike alone, not because she was reckless, but because she trusted herself. Then Mary Ann explained what it had done to her to live with uncertainty for 6 years. "Not knowing is its own kind of violence," she told the jury. "It rearranges everything in you. It makes you question your own mind." She looked at Kessler then. He didn't look away. He watched her with the same calm stare he'd used in interrogation, and Marianne understood something she hadn't fully understood before. He liked being looked at. He liked being the center of a story. So she stopped looking. When Thomas spoke later, his voice broke only once. "My daughter didn't disappear," he said. "Someone took her." And he wrote it down like she was a thing he found on a trail. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Those were 3 days of waiting, in a way Marianne had almost forgotten was possible. Waiting that had an end point, waiting that would produce an answer. On the morning of October 22nd, 2021, the jury returned. The courtroom stood as the jurors filed in. Marianne's knees felt weak, but she refused to sit until the judge did, as if standing was the last remaining form of control she could claim. The foreperson read the verdicts. Guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Nora Hart. Guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Haley Granger. Guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Sierra Lane. There were no cheers, no outbursts, just quiet sounds of people losing their breath and then finding it again in sobs. Marianne folded forward into Thomas's shoulder, shaking. Thomas stared straight ahead, face hard and wet, as if he couldn't believe the world had finally chosen clarity. Kessler showed no reaction. He didn't flinch. He didn't look down. He didn't look away. It was as if the verdict didn't change what mattered to him, that he had been inside their lives for years, even from a distance, even before his name was known. Sentencing was scheduled for late November. At sentencing, Quinn asked for consecutive life terms. She spoke about the pattern, the intent, the cruelty of predation in places people believed were safe. The defense begged for mercy, painting Kessler as damaged, isolated, mentally ill. He said prison had already punished him enough. Kessler was invited to speak. He stood slowly, hands shackled, and for a moment Marianne feared what he might say. Some final taunt, some attempt to reclaim narrative, some smile turned into words. Instead, he said only, "I didn't mean for things to go like that." It was the closest thing to remorse he could manufacture, and it wasn't close at all. The judge sentenced him to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He would die in prison. As deputies led him away, Kessler turned his head toward the front row. His eyes found Marianne's. He held her gaze for a long, deliberate beat. Marianne looked back without blinking, then turned away first, refusing him that last piece of attention. The weeks after sentencing felt unreal. Marianne had spent 8 years living in a suspended state, every thought tied to one question. Where is my daughter? Now she had the answer, terrible and final, and the uncertainty that had eaten her from the inside was replaced by grief that at least had boundaries. In late November 2021, Marianne and Thomas returned to Pisgah for the first time since the verdict. They brought a small wooden box containing Nora's ashes. The remains had been released months earlier, but Marianne hadn't been ready to let them go. She had kept the box on her nightstand, sometimes speaking to it in the dark, telling Nora about the trial, about how the world finally said her name out loud in the right way, with responsibility attached. It was raining the morning they arrived at Laurel Fork Campground, a cold mist that softened the world and made the hemlocks drip steadily. The campground was nearly empty late season, quiet, the kind of emptiness that used to feel peaceful. They hiked together to Bear Hollow Branch, to the cairn where hikers had left stones for years. The laminated photo had been replaced many times. The stones had multiplied, stacked higher by hands that never knew Nora, but refused to let her fade. Marianne knelt and set the box at the base. When she opened it, the ash didn't pour so much as drift, caught by wind and moisture, carried into the trees and toward the creek, as if the forest were finally releasing what it had held. Thomas stood behind her, with a hand on her shoulder. His tears fell without sound. They stayed a long time, listening to rain and water and wind. When they finally stood, Mary Ann didn't feel peace. Not yet. But she felt the beginning of something like it. A shift, small but undeniable, like the first clear day after a long storm. In January 2022, Detective Jordan Pike resumed the one thread that still bothered him. Marisol Vega, missing since 2011 in the Shining Rock Wilderness. Pike believed Kessler was responsible, but belief wasn't enough. Without remains, there could be no final charge, no formal accounting. Pike returned to Shining Rock again and again, following leads from hikers, checking areas where Kessler had been sighted, combing ridgelines that were brutal in winter and thick with growth in summer. In July 2022, a climbing team reported finding human remains in a remote gulch below a cliff, band buried under rockfall and leaf litter. Rangers secured the area. Pike drove out with forensic staff and watched the careful extraction like a man who had learned that patience sometimes paid in the worst possible currency. Dental records confirmed identity. Marisol Vega. She had been less than 3 miles from where her tent was found, close enough that the truth felt almost cruel. With that discovery, Pike and Quinn added a final charge post-conviction, not for a new trial. Kessler would never see parole anyway, but for record, for truth, for the family. Marisol's parents held a quiet funeral that autumn. Pike attended and stood in the back, uncomfortable with praise and condolences. Closing a case didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a final sentence in a story that should have never been written. The state also changed how it handled certain missing person cases. In early 2022, Brewer testified before a legislative committee, arguing for improved interagency coordination, better campground documentation, and increased funding for forensic technology, especially DNA processing and search resources. A bill passed later that year, inspired by the Hart case. It required North Carolina National Forest campgrounds to implement digital check-ins with verified identification and emergency contact information, and it created a faster pathway for families to submit DNA references into state systems at the start of a case, not years later. It wouldn't stop every tragedy, but it might shorten the years of silence that ate families alive. Mary Ann became an advocate. She joined a national organization supporting families of missing persons and began speaking at conferences, less about fear, more about procedures, the practical steps people don't know to take until it's too late. She talked about wilderness safety with a blunt honesty that sometimes made people uncomfortable. That was fine with her. Comfort had never saved anyone. She also started a scholarship-funded Warren Wilson and Nora's name to support students in environmental science and conservation work. Students who loved the land and wanted to protect it, even knowing what the land had hidden. The first recipient was a young woman who admitted she'd been afraid to hike alone after hearing Nora's story. The scholarship helped her buy gear, pay for field courses, and most importantly, reclaim a relationship with the outdoors that fear had tried to steal. Thomas returned to teaching part-time at a community college. For years, he had lived among maps and spreadsheets and case files. After the verdict, he boxed them and gave them to Pike, who was building a database of unsolved wilderness disappearances. Thomas still hiked, but never alone. Never without telling someone exactly where he was going. He loved the mountains, but he no longer believed they were harmless. Kessler disappeared into the prison system. He refused interviews, declined to speak to journalists. Guards reported he spent hours in the library reading books about geology, wildlife, and survival. Like the woods were still the only language he understood. A forensic psychologist later published an analysis of his journals, describing patterns consistent with predatory fixation and antisocial traits. The paper suggested the 4 known victims might not be his only victims. After it circulated, other families contacted authorities, asking for their cold cases to be reviewed. Some were reopened. Some remained unresolved. Because even when one predator is caged, the wilderness still keeps what it has kept. On August 18, 2024, 11 years after Nora Hart disappeared, a memorial walk was organized at Laurel Fork Campground. Over 100 people attended. Many had never known Nora, but they'd followed the case, felt the injustice, watched the years crawl. They walked the trail together in silence, carrying candles even though it was midday. When they reached Bear Hollow Branch, they found the cairn larger than ever, stones piled high. Beside it, someone had planted a young cedar tree. A small plaque at its base read, Nora Hart, 1994-2013. The mountains remember. Mary Ann and Thomas stood among strangers who felt, in that moment, like family. Mary Ann laid her hand on the tree's rough bark and tried to imagine it decades from now. Tall, rooted, unbothered by the human stories beneath it. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that something good could grow out of something terrible. Sergeant Allison Brewer retired in late 2024 after 3 decades in law enforcement. Her final act was to ensure Nora's case, file sanitized for privacy and legal limits, was digitized and used as a training tool for investigators handling wilderness disappearances. What to preserve, what to track, how not to let time bury evidence the way soil did. At her retirement gathering, Pike presented Brewer with a framed photograph of Nora smiling in front of a waterfall, the same image that had once been laminated and placed on a cairn. On the back, Mary Ann had written, "You did what the mountains would not. You brought her back to us." Pisgah remained one of the most beautiful places in the southern Appalachians. Thousands of people hiked its trails every year, camped beneath its trees, and found comfort in its green silence. Most would never know Nora Hart's name, but some would. Some would see the cairn by Bear Hollow Branch, read the plaque, touch the cedar tree, and understand that wilderness is not only beauty, it is also indifference. It is also risk. It is also a place where lives can be stolen and hidden. And those people would leave a stone of their own, a small weight of remembrance, a refusal to let a name disappear again. Mary Ann still visited the forest twice a year, once in August, once in May. She walked more slowly now. Thomas's health made the hike hard, so sometimes she went alone, not because she wanted solitude, but because grief had taught her how to carry weight. She sat beside the cairn and spoke quietly, as if the trees could translate her words into something Nora might hear. She watched the creek move past endlessly, faithfully, carrying everything downstream. And when she finally stood to leave, she brushed dirt from her knees, touched the cedar tree one last time, and walked back toward the trailhead, toward her car, toward home, carrying the knowledge that love persists even after death, that memory is stronger than forgetting, and that some lights once extinguished still glow in the people who refuse to let them go out. Nora Hart is not forgotten. She never will be. The mountains remember, and so do we.